counter the criticism that might come at them. So it was something that was people objected at the time, but the sort of mainstream thought was pushed forward by a particular group of scientists who sort of had a stake in the specimen and were convinced that it was genuine.
So let's go back again. Charles Dawson, of course, was the man who, as you said, got on the phone to his mate Arthur Smith Woodward and just found these bits of fragments. Maybe it could be something. Who was he, and why did he actually start this entire mess?
Right. So Charles Dawson was a lawyer, a solicitor. He lived in Sussex. That was what he did professionally. But he was also a very avid amateur sort of collector of archaeological specimens and of natural history specimens. So he was involved in all the sort of, the learned societies that were all over Britain at that time, and he was extremely active in them. So that's why he was friends with people like Smith Woodward. He had these connections, but he was an amateur, and I think that may have been something that he really wanted to rise above the amateur status and really prove himself as a big deal in that community, and get all the trappings to be made a member of the Royal Society and all those sorts of things. So he shows up quite regularly sort of in these kind of in these sort of societies and publications, often with very spectacular specimens that no one else has ever been able to secure, which wasn't, and this is quite recent that people realise this. I think when they were first trying to work out the culprit of the hoax, they would always say, we're not entirely sure, we think, Charles Dawson was always the suspect, but they would be very reluctant to name him. Whereas in the last few decades, investigations into his collections and into the things that he claims were found and put into his collections have shown that he was responsible for dozens and dozens of false specimens, of manufactured specimens, or specimens that, or perhaps genuine specimens, but the nature of their discovery had been fabricated. So now it seems, absolutely, unquestionable that this was his masterwork in a career of fake specimens.
Just extraordinary. So, what, he made fake fossils, did he? Is that what he did, and then put them somewhere in the dig?
But in terms of Piltdown, but that's what's presumed. Yeah, again, it seems like that he's definitely the guy, but how it happened, we don't really know. There's not been sort of any documentation, obviously, to make that clear. But he was present. Every time a fossil was found at the Piltdown site, Charles Dawson was present. Smith Woodward did visit the site in Charles Dawson's absence and never found a single thing. Not a single thing was ever recovered without Dawson being on site. So we presume he manufactured the fossils. So he would take real bones that he had gotten, who knows how, and stain them. He would stain them so that they looked older. He would fill up the spaces in them with gravel so that they would feel heavier. And in some instances, he would do things like file down the teeth. So they looked and felt like real old fossils. And then we assume he must have just sort of, just placed it on a prominent but not too prominent spot where someone would definitely find it. And then just sort of wait for the quote unquote discovery to take place, and he could go over and say, oh, look at that, isn't that lovely? And of course he also found these things himself as well. He was often on site and was the discoverer of many of these fragments.
He was dedicated, wasn't he, to his particular craft? So did he get the glory, if that's what you think he was looking for, when he was the scientific community saying, oh, look at these fragments, this is the missing link? Was Charles Dawson sort of basking in the glow of this discovery?
Oh, absolutely. It simply could not have gone any better. Like he got the name Eoanthropus dawsoni. That's getting a species named after you. Surely there can't be much sort of greater honour than that for scientific people. Even though it was a fake species, he still got the name. Got all these things being announced at these learned societies, all the biggest names in science talking about the specimen, thinking about the specimen. In terms of what he had hoped for, or what we presume he had hoped for, he just absolutely nailed it. And just, as I've said, the fact that it was so fully incorporated into the scientific community, that it was embraced so thoroughly, that even though there were criticisms, people pointing out that it didn't make sense. You know, the biggest names in science of the day coming to the defense of Eoanthropus and saying, no, this is the real deal and we support it 100%. I think it's absolutely crazy how well the hoax worked, how perfectly it worked.
Full marks for your hoax, Charles Dawson. Nicely done. Rowan Long is the curator at the Harry Brooks Allen Museum of Anatomy and Pathology at the University of Melbourne. We're talking about something that's gone down in history as the Piltdown hoax. So it took until the 1950s to prove that it was a hoax. Were there people who were working during the period leading up to that who were saying, actually, I'm sure this is it's some kind of hoax, some kind of fake, and I'm trying to prove it, or how did it all unravel?
As far as I'm aware, I don't think there was no suggestion of hoaxing or fraudulence until people they were looking at it in the 50s for sort of different reasons. They wanted to analyse it and inspect it, but they weren't trying to uncover a hoax. So, and there's a number of reasons. As I mentioned, very few people actually handled or really got a good look at the original specimens. They usually work from casts, so a closer inspection of the specimens by more people might have made it more obvious at a sooner time. The fact that it was so well supported by the establishment and by the most powerful scientists of the time, there was not a lot of incentive to try and criticize or find something wrong with these specimens. But also by that point, it was such a massive sensation when it was found in 1912, and continued to be so, a decade or two after that. But over the decades, more specimens were being found, real specimens were being found, and more analysis and more research was being done on the human fossils that we had. The Eoanthropus, it started to become a bit of an embarrassing kind of anomaly. It was still there in the background, but it was becoming more and more awkward to make it fit into the theories and the hypotheses that were being worked out with real fossils, unsurprisingly. So by the time, by the 1950s, it wasn't such a huge deal anymore. It was really, the embarrassing oddity that they were trying to work out how to fit into the real frameworks that were being established. So I think it was in the 1950s, there was a team that was led by a guy called Joseph Wiener from Oxford University, and I think they were just trying to try out fluorine dating on that specimen. So that was one of the earliest forms of absolute dating, where you would use isotopes of fluorine to work out ages of specimens. And what they wanted to do was just see if the jaw fragments and the skull fragments had the same age. So this was looking at whether they really did go together, not whether they were real fossils, but whether they went together. And so they did that, this new technique, and they found that, it was a success, because they were the same age. So, a lot of some players were like, oh yeah, absolutely, they're the same age.
Right, Charles Dawson had made them at the same time.
Exactly right. But they had an absolute date on this one. So they found they were the same age. They also found they were way, way younger than they should have been. So I think at that time they got a date of a few 10,000 years. So not 500,000 years. Relatively recent. Now, some people said, oh, that's okay, this is new technology, it's not worked out properly, it hasn't, it's shown us they're the same age, that's right, but it's mucked up the absolute date. But Joseph Wiener et al., this is when it started to just creep in, where they're like, there's something not right about this, we think that age probably is more accurate, that it is younger than they said it wants to go here. And I think that's when that new type of analysis started happening, where they were like, what's the real story with this fossil? And I think at this point, that protectiveness of the original fossils had eroded somewhat, and they were able to get access to the fossils themselves, not casts. And I think slowly, it dawned on them, oh my God, this is fake, this is not real, it's not what it's supposed to be at all. But that was not where they started from. It was only after a lot of analysis that unthinkable thought became obvious.
Just imagine though, you're the person in the lab that day suddenly putting it all together and going, oh my goodness, we've all been hoaxed for the last 30, 40 years.
Exactly.
Incredible. Was Charles Dawson still around?
No. So that's the thing, and I think this he died in 1916, so just 4 years after the initial.
He went out in a blaze of glory then.
He went out in a blaze of glory, and I think ironically, it almost served to make the hoax go on longer. His absence, like sometimes, if he'd stuck around, maybe he might have given himself up. Maybe he would have made a mistake. Maybe he would have been, too ambitious, started putting out too much stuff. But because he died at that time, it was exactly enough material to be really exciting, but it never got too far. So I think, it's crazy to think that due to no fault of his own, his death probably made it drag on for far longer. But he didn't get to see it. He didn't get to see all this stuff. So I guess he went out on a high note, and he went out and he died thinking, wow, I have absolutely nailed this, and he did.
So Rowan, you said that, this was one of the hugest news stories at the time when they discovered these fragments and said, look, here's the missing link. Was it as well covered when everyone figured out that it was all a hoax?
I suspect not. I think Wiener and his team wrote a book. They wrote a big book saying, here's how we did it, which is a fantastic publication that would have been very widely read and investigated. But I think at this point, 41 years on, everyone was just, it was already becoming a bit awkward, as I mentioned. It was already becoming something that wasn't fitting into the scene and sort of just didn't make sense. I think everyone was pretty ready to move on. Everyone was pretty ready to just go, right, that was embarrassing, let's get on with it. And I think a lot of the people that were passionately involved at it, in those early days, they had either died like Dawson, or really gotten really old or retired, or just they weren't, the whole scientific community had moved on in many ways. So I think it was certainly well known, but it was not the sensation that the discovery was.
Still, did anyone from that scientific community who had so passionately supported the idea, was anyone still alive to sort of front up and go, yeah, okay, we were completely fooled?
Yes. I think Arthur Keith, might have been someone who. So Arthur Keith was a really prominent anatomist. He was very a strong proponent of Piltdown Man. And also very influential, very powerful. But he did eventually, he lived long enough to say, you know what, I was wrong, and he had to concede that he backed the wrong horse. So he was a very prominent example of that. But not many people, I think, sort of lived for long enough over that immense amount of time that it had happened.
I know you've had 2 world wars through the middle of all of that and all of those changes. And I guess Rowan, as you say, science had moved forward a long way between 1912 and the 1950s. So I guess in some ways you can say, well, we can understand that, you fell for it because the science at the time was a lot more rudimentary than what it was by the 1950s. Do you know, Rowan, is that box of fragments still around anywhere? Surely that deserves to be in a museum.
It is, yes. I was looking into this. It's because it's really funny that it's scientifically not, it doesn't have a great deal of value, but socio-culturally it's immensely important, I think. And I looked into this, and it's rarely, if ever, been put on display since it was revealed to be a hoax. It has been. I know at least on one occasion it was displayed in the Natural History Museum. I think they're talking about an anniversary of Piltdown. But that was very briefly. It's almost never. It's not something prominently displayed. So maybe there is still a little bit of a hint of regret at the Natural History Museum. They don't want to draw too much attention to it.
Maybe another 50 years or so they'll be ready to get that out, because look, it's a cracker of a yarn. So just before I let you go, Rowan, obviously you said everybody bought it, people thought this was the missing link. Did it actually affect the way that anthropologists and archaeologists thought at the time? Did it sort of push off that study into the wrong direction for a while?
Oh yeah, it really did. It certainly reinforced the idea of a Eurocentric kind of history for prehistory for human beings. So it kept pushing that idea that Europe was the place to find the interesting fossils. There were people that were saying, hey, look, I reckon we're going to find great stuff in Asia, and Homo erectus was discovered in Indonesia in the 1890s, but that didn't get so much, there wasn't such a drive to investigate that. there were people on the ground in Africa. So we know now that the real, the missing link is not really a good term to use, but that sort of those early stages of prehistoric human species, that sort of between what we would call apes and what we call humans, we know we can find the real good stuff in Africa. That's where there are these incredible fossils, particularly of a species called, or a genus called Australopithecus. So Australopithecus is that's really what they were looking for, was Australopithecus. And no one wanted to look in Africa. They thought that would be a ridiculous idea. And there was a guy in Africa named Raymond Dart who actually found a juvenile Australopithecus skull at exactly this time. And he sent, he spoke to all the people, all these same people that were going gaga over Piltdown, and said, check this out, I found the real deal here. I've got this incredible thing I'm calling Australopithecus. It's got features of apes, it's got features of humans, it's the real deal. And that was really strongly pushed back on as being not worth anybody's time. And it's very traceable to Piltdown, where they were like, we don't need to worry about that. We're not going to find interesting things in Africa, and it's not the right kind of thing. So Piltdown had it was constructed of a human skull or skull fragments and a orangutan jawbone. So it was a human-brained, monkey-jawed being, whereas the Australopithecus is more like a human-jawed, monkey-brained being, and that is not what they wanted to see. They were like, that can't be real. That can't be a genuine find, or a genuine ancestor of humans, because we know they very much like the idea of big brains evolving very early on, where that's not really the case. We have things like Australopithecus, which walked upright, which had quite a small human-like jaw, but had quite small brains. So the large brains didn't come till later on, and that did not fit in with their preferred hypothesis, whereas Piltdown did. Piltdown had a nice big brain at the right time. So Australopithecus, that the investigations into Australopithecus and into African fossil sites could have happened, decades and decades earlier than they did. But Piltdown really derailed that line of inquiry. And also the fact that, and that sort of very beguiling idea that that England was the place to look for these early humans, not somewhere like Africa, which was not didn't really work with ideas of white supremacy and sort of British. The British Empire's dominance at the time.
What a story, Rowan. Look, thank you so much for telling it so well for us tonight. Rowan Long is the curator at the Harry Brooks Allen Museum of Anatomy and Pathology at the University of Melbourne. It's been great to chat with you, Rowan.
No worries. Thank you so much for having me.
And it was this week in history that these new bones were, quote unquote, discovered on an archaeological dig in East Sussex in the area of Piltdown.
You've been listening to a Nightlife podcast. For more great conversations about...
This episode is brought to you by Mercedes-Benz and the C-Class Edition C. Now you can take advantage of exceptional savings on a suite of special features for a limited time. From its avant-garde styling and 18-inch alloy wheels to its diamond pattern trim and comfort seats, the C-Class Edition C is in a C-Class of its own. Visit mercedes-benz.com.au to learn more. Offer ends September 30, T's and C's apply.
This episode is brought to you by ANZ and Cash Rewards. Attention savvy shoppers. You could earn cash back on purchases from top brands like Amazon, Booking.com, Target, Rebel and more. So, if you want to earn cash back, start shopping through Cash Rewards with your ANZ debit or credit card. Join for free today. Search anz.com/Cash Rewards. Cash Rewards is offered by Cash Rewards and not ANZ. To earn cash back, you must be a Cash Rewards member. Eligibility criteria and T's and C's apply.
At Amacium, love shouldn't come with handcuffs, so you'll get a great mobile plan with no lock-in contract, so you're free to leave whenever you want. Not that you'd ever want to leave an incredible relationship like this. I mean, we'd be really sad, devastated even, but we'd keep it to ourselves. And if you passed us in the street, we'd be like, hey, how's it going? And play it cool, but afterwards we'd have a little cry and call a friend who'd come over and say, they're not worth it! Get an incredible mobile plan with no lock-in contract at Amacium. No handcuffs, no worries. Little sim, big love. Amacium.
Welcome to the New Books Network.
Hello, welcome to New Books and Music, a channel on the New Books Network. My name is Bradley Morgan, and I am joined today by my guest, Marissa R. Moss. Marissa is an award-winning journalist who has written about gender inequality within country music, and whose work has appeared in outlets
country music. So we've always kind of done a poor job of giving women their proper critical due. I mean, we even sort of, Dolly Parton, though she's enormously beloved now, was kind of like just a critical blonde joke up until 15, 20 years ago. I mean, she was not looked up as this bastion of, songwriting ability and artistic genius and altruism and all that until fairly recently, when we look back and everyone was like, oh my God. But yeah, she's always been in on her joke in the best possible way, but we didn't start giving Dolly her due until pretty recently.
You brought up Loretta Lynn and writing about the pill and abortion and birth control as an example of country music in the 60s and 70s, but these are still outlaw ideas even now when we consider legislation that has been passed in many states, I know yours and Tennessee included, that continue to have severe detrimental impact on women. How is that still being reflected in country music today?
Yeah, I mean, it's incredible to think about a song like The Pill in the context of, I think, especially where we are today, and how I don't think we've probably made any progress in terms of how the reception to a song like that would be. I don't think it would not be played on country radio today, just as it wasn't played on country radio then. I mean, you have artists like Margot Price, for example, who's really kind of forward about her political beliefs, not just in private or in public, but also in her songwriting. And, I don't think she really made an aggressive go at country radio at any point, but it never, they never made any attempt at bringing her into their fold either. And you see it now, even when someone like, Maren Morris is outspoken about her beliefs, just kind of the constant backlash that she has to navigate. But there's an audience for country music like that. I think there's a huge audience for country music like that. And there's certainly the audience that would be find themselves in my book, I would hope.
Well, you shine a light on a lot of artists in your book, but you primarily cover three people in particular. One of the women you profile throughout the book is Casey Musgraves, who is now a very accomplished and successful country singer. Can you share with us what her background was like as a young performer?
Sure. I mean, Casey got started, as little as you can imagine. She had a yodeling duo called the Texas Two Bits. When she was not even in the double digits. So she kind of knew really, really young that she had a talent, but not only had the talent, but had the ambition and the drive to want to do something with it, make it her career. She was from a really tiny town in rural Texas, and her parents were super supportive, super creative and artistic. So, when she was bored, they were like, go write a poem. And so she did, go ride your bike, get outside. And so she sang in this duo called the Texas Two Bits. She played at George W. Bush's inaugural ball, which is really interesting, and eventually went out on her own as a solo artist, when she was around 13, first band breakup at 13. And, like a lot of artists, I think spent some time kind of figuring out her own voice and who she was and who she wasn't, but never really kind of lacked in purpose and kind of the final destination, which was to be a songwriter. I don't think she ever sat around and dreamt of superstardom as her outcome. Maybe to the degree that, she's a superstar now. She's playing huge venues and winning Grammy of the, album of the year. But I don't think she dreamt of superstardom. I think she dreamt of being a successful songwriter. which makes it kind of even cooler. There are sort of purists and traditionalists. But country music does really like to stay exactly where it is and stay with what's working, and it's very hesitant to change. And these problems, this sort of deeply embedded and baked in misogyny is so prevalent and so accepted and so part of the norm that I don't think anyone knows how to fight against it or how to work against it. And it's even upheld by the women themselves a lot of the time, you know, whether by choice or by sort of factors out of their control or fear that if they speak out, they will be sort of pushed out or punished, which is a real fear. So there's no real path, I think, that a lot of people see out of these circumstances.
You write in your book, one perfect example of the crushing duality of that country music industrial complex and the way it prioritizes comfort or even lies over truth is the story of Shelley Wright. Could you tell us more about her?
Sure. So Shelley was a big country star in the 90s. So she came onto the scene. She had a big hit single called Single White Female. I think it was in 98. Terrible with dates and times. But she was kind of, you know, at the time, one of the one-name female country artists, like a Shania. Super talented, great voice, great songwriter. She was also firmly in the closet. She's a lesbian. She was firmly in the closet at the time for sheer reasons of fear. You know, she knew that there would be consequences for coming out in Nashville within her, and also within her faith system, and so she lived in the closet until 2010. All through her time in country music, having to, you know, sing about dating men and have hits off of that, and just kind of having to live this lie, essentially, out of deep, deep fear. And, you know, she was right when she finally came out. She had a wonderful book where she told her story, and obviously has not had a hit on country radio since then, and I don't think would even sort of desire to try. But, you know, she kind of had to, she was living this lie in her life and in her song because she knew she had to survive, which is really, really heartbreaking. You know, she got to the point where she was considering, you know, she had thoughts of suicide, and she just knew she couldn't, you know, live like that anymore. But for her, it was not, can I have both of these things? It was always, if I live my truth, I'm going to have to sacrifice country stardom. And we are, even to this day, I think, still wrestling with that, in terms of, you know, can we have a queer country star? And we have nowhere, you know, not come anywhere near close enough to being able to, to being able to reckon with that, I think.
Another artist who you profile throughout the book is Maren Morris, who you write was proof that a little girl with talent could break through and sing with otherworldly maturity. Can you tell us about where Maren comes from?
Sure. So Maren was born outside of Dallas, in a town called Arlington. And, you know, similar to Casey Musgrave, she discovered her voice really young, but they did have very different kind of paths in terms of, Maren kind of hopped into, like, the bar scene very early. Casey was, you know, performing in her country duo, but Maren was on stage with, you know, an electric guitar twice the size of her body, starting at 11 years old, playing in dance halls and honky-tonks and bars in Texas. Really looked up to Leanne Rimes. really looked up to Patty Griffin, to the Chicks, and was just kind of playing music constantly, with backing band of men 2 or 3 times her age, and just kind of playing the Texas circuit, and doing that until she was in her late teens. The entire time through her high school years, she was, going to school during the day, and then on the weekends touring regionally around Texas. Had a couple albums even before her major label debut, even some regional Texas airplay. So she definitely kind of was able to achieve the most success that the Texas country scene would probably allow a woman to have, which is a limited amount. But yeah, I mean, I don't know if a lot of people know, sometimes you see someone kind of come onto the scene and you assume that they just sort of came out of nowhere or was an industry plant or some kind of crazy thing. But Marion had been working at it for, again, like Casey, since, before she was in the double digits.
So while Casey and Marion were young performers honing their craft, it was during President Bush's first term in office, and during this time 9/11 happened and its impact reverberated everywhere. What was 9/11's impact on country music?
It was huge. So at the time of 9/11, you had these, big, powerful women of country music kind of reigning, still pretty strong. They were on the decline a little bit in terms of country airplay, but you had, Faith Hill and Reba and Shania putting out these big ballads and pop crossover moments. 9/11 happened, and suddenly country music makes this shift to super patriotic songs. So, Toby Keith had this song. I guess patriotic is almost a kind word. Some of them were downright nationalistic. And you had Toby Keith singing about putting a boot in a terrorist's ass, and all these, very sort of patriotic, red, white, and blue, bow to the flag kind of stuff that just was no longer working up against, in the eyes of these programmers, against these ballads and, big moments from the women of country music. And so they were just, put aside. If you're gonna, have to choose between a Shania Twain song and a, put a boot in a terrorist ass song, they were going with the boot in the terrorist ass. And that continued for a long time and kind of evolved into, feeding that nostalgia syndrome that we were talking about. So it was, pro-America, and then, small town, all of that, go back to when things were good again, all kind of, were dominoes in the same line.
One of the biggest stories in music at that time was what happened to the Dixie Chicks, who would later rename themselves as the Chicks following the aftermath of George Floyd's murder. And this was a trio of women who were incredibly talented and wildly successful, but despite that, at that time, they were still not held to the same esteem as their male peers. Can you talk about the success and what happened to them as country radio was becoming more patriotic?
Sure. So, as you said, the Chicks, they were massive stars, not just in country music, but across all genres of music. They were playing, in the country music space at country music festivals, played on country radio like crazy, but also showing up at Lilith Fair. So they were kind of hitting all kinds of sides of the culture. And even, they had a song called Traveling Soldier that was about kind of the pains and losses of the war. That was getting some country airplay leading into what ended up happening with them, which was speaking out against the war on the eve of the invasion of Iraq, and doing it on foreign soil, and getting kind of almost instantaneously banned from country radio, pushed out of country music, People organized chick smashing parties where they would run tractors over their albums. I think it would be really interesting to think about what would have happened if they were men making the same statement. There would have been some consequences, I'm sure, but I don't think there would have been the same kind of coordinated efforts to just completely dispose of them from country music, especially because there was kind of this already, but yeah, I think there was a sentiment that they were getting a little bit too mouthy and holding a little bit too much power for women, that people were definitely already uncomfortable with that. So I think there was almost like a, I don't want to say that people were happy to have a reason to dispose of them, but it's possible.
Well, let's talk about that. Around this time, women were still expected to sing ballads and crossover hits in country music, but as you said, men were performing songs about fighting and killing terrorists. But at the same time, women were also seen as inauthentic in country music. And I want to know what exactly was so authentic about rich white men writing these songs from their mansions that appealed to country music fans, especially those fans who would actually enlist in the military in response to 9/11.
That's a very good question, and one that I wish I understood more. And I think one that we haven't departed from. Jason Aldean is still kind of making his living off of this down home connection to the working man, and meanwhile is constantly posting Instagram stories from his Florida mansions and traveling on private jets. Not saying he's not allowed to do that. Most rock stars or successful artists do. But why does he get to sort of sell that idea of connection to the working man when a woman is seen as totally disconnected and inauthentic? And I think this, it comes back to even this idea of authenticity itself, holding on to whatever that means. We do it so very strongly in country music, yet no one can ever really explain what authentic is. And when we think of an authentic country singer, we think of like a man in jeans and a flannel shirt and a cowboy hat or a trucker hat. That is sort of this farce of authenticity that we've created in our heads to tell the story of country music. And it's why I like the picture, the cover of the book has a picture of Casey Musgraves on it in a miniskirt and heels, playing at a rock and roll, playing at Lollapalooza in Chicago. And that is not, sort of a quote, authentic presentation of country music as we like to be attached to it. But, I think, it expresses what I love about country music. Casey Musgraves expresses what I love about country music, but I don't ever want to use that that word authentic. And it's such a very good way to gatekeep people out of country music, is to have this sort of authenticity test in your head, and that most often means you're a male. It certainly means you're white. Certainly means you're straight. And if you are not any of those things, then you have to, sort of cater to all these other really meaningless markers to try to prove your authenticity constantly. And those are just kind of ludicrous constraints to place on an art form. And yet we do it constantly in country music.
There was something you wrote in your book that was so incredibly profound. You write, "The patriotic obsession in country music also gave the coastal press a chance to dismiss the listeners, who they already assumed were poor and uneducated and simply did not know better. And I thought what made this so profound was because the dichotomy between the media and country music fans was incredibly useful to Donald Trump's presidential campaign. Can you talk more about this dichotomy and the effects it had?
Yeah, I mean, I thought it was really important to point that out and to sort of deconstruct how there is this kind of constant dismissal of country music as a high art form, this constant dismissal of a country music fan, country music listener that so closely mirrors, it's done by, I think you can kind of refer to it as the coastal press as a blanket term. That really reflects, I think, what happens in kind of our broader perceptions of rural people, people who live in red states, all of that in the way of, that you can really see reflected in politics. I mean, I think of, sort of Hillary Clinton saying that Trump's followers, is a basket of deplorables or whatever I personally understand exactly what she was trying to say. But I think though in that being interpreted, people interpreting what she said as not, talking about the people sort of he was choosing to have him around him politically, but that she was speaking directly to them. There was a reason that they thought that she was looking down on them so strongly, is because it happens kind of constantly. There is a dismissal of Southern and rural and Midwestern people and people in red states that I think is, you can draw this very close parallel, obviously, to what happens in country music, that is really important and interesting to look at. And it's why I picked a group of people all from Texas, because it made a really interesting way to kind of parallel to the way that we look at Texas politically now. And I'll see it now, when sort of some kind of really horrible, anti-trans or abortion legislation comes up, people, kind of in blue states will say, oh, well, everyone there deserved it. You guys voted for that. Which is such a, a blanket, dangerous way to talk about an entire group of people. There are, and at the end of the day, it's usually a black woman that comes along to save us after we've made all those assumptions, as with Georgia. But I kind of wanted to make sure to highlight that part of the story. Sort of put a little bit of the blame too back on the music press for how they've sort of thought about country music and treated it over the years. It's not an easy thing to do, and maybe not advantageous if you're, wanting people to talk about your book in those places, but I felt that it was necessary to kind of call them on it.
Absolutely, I agree. I think it's very important to explore that dichotomy because there is an industry advantage in that. And you write about that industry advantage because country music as an industry wanted to facilitate a connection with its fans and become more important to its fans than ever. But this was happening at a time when much of white America was growing increasingly angry and alienated during the Trump administration. And so I want to know how the industry fed into the ethos of country music and reflected that.
It's been incredibly interesting to see and watch how country music has responded. And in some ways, it's been really heartening to see certain artists decide to finally start speaking up for what they believe in and trying to reach fans that only they can reach. That's kind of the unique power of country music. It does have this deep connection with fans that aren't always spoken to by other types of music. But there has been another segment of country music and the country music world that's really decided to kind of double down and I would say almost take advantage of people feeling alienated and angry and use it to forge a stronger connection with them. I've been seeing artists like Jason Aldean who pledged for years that they would never, keep politics and music separate, won't comment on elections, won't comment on anything, even to the point that he was standing on stage during a mass shooting and still would not comment about gun control. So adamant to keep up that politics, no politics in my music, no music in my politics. But come Trump and come the events of January 6th and Biden winning the election and certain people believing that he did not do it lawfully have decided to kind of use that anger and alienation, I think, to connect with fans and suddenly become outspoken politically. Kind of I was watching some of them post Instagram stories, with election fraud. Suddenly they're outspoken about election fraud after 20 years of not saying a thing, and it's getting them fans. It's bringing them fans that I don't think really cared about, who maybe didn't love or care about their music before because they just liked Trump or believed in the election lie or all of these things, and they needed something to hang on to. And that's really scary to me because I'm seeing artists do that I don't know if they, I don't know if it's worse or if you do or don't believe these things, but I'm seeing artists kind of transparently use that connection with this angry, alienated fan base, and that that's troubling and scary.
A lot of the artists we're talking about are largely white men, and I wanted to discuss Trump's influence on stoking white fear and emboldening white supremacy before we discuss the third woman you profile throughout the book, Mickey Guyton, who is one of only 4 black women solo artists that chart in country music. Can you tell us more about Mickey's background?
Sure, yeah. So all 3 of the women that I focused on in the book come from Texas. And Mickey grew up in a couple different places in Texas, across Waco, Arlington, outside of Dallas. And unlike Casey and unlike Marin, did not kind of grow up performing on the Texas circuit. I think in part because that environment would not have been conducive to a young black woman in rural Texas trying to come up and sing country songs in honky tonks. And but she did sing in church, and her talent was kind of immediately clear to her parents and everyone around her. She too loved LeAnn Rimes and the Chicks and Shania. I think what was different is that she was very aware of the fact that she did not look, she looked around, she did not see not just a black woman, she, with the exception of Charlie Pride, was not seeing, a black country artist on MTV and, CMT. She was very, she understood that it was an extremely closed off industry with kind of deep racist roots that had not been reckoned with. And so when she graduated from high school, she went to LA to pursue a college degree, but also acting, because I think she thought, well, I like entertainment, but country music is just way too tough for a black woman and closed off to me, and that didn't really fit because she wanted to be a country singer. And eventually, when she had decided to kind of finally give up on, the entertainment industry, ran into someone that mentioned to her that he had been working with a producer who was kind of looking to work with a black female country artist. She was like, oh, well, you found your person. And she was signed to a major label in Nashville. And interestingly enough, kind of all around the same time as Casey was signed, as Mira was signed. And again, that's sort of the reason why I chose this group of three women, because even given the enormous struggles that women face, it is really important to highlight the even larger and higher barriers that Black women in country music face. And you can do that by seeing, you know, Casey, Mary, Mickey all came to Nashville around the same time. They all came from Texas. They're all women. Why was Mickey's record not put out until last year? You know, and I constantly wanted to make sure that I was kind of checking that, and you know, being as intersectional as possible in my conversations around this.
Well, you share a really interesting story about Mickey, and it's as she progresses throughout her career, she eventually gets to perform before President Obama. And one would think that performing for a president would be a real boost, but it wasn't exactly the jumping off point for Mickey that she needed, because you still needed a record label to push you to country radio, and this was not enough to do that. Can you tell us about the erasure Black women have endured within country radio?
Yeah, I mean, like you said, is you know, she had this moment playing for President Obama, and she even told me, you know, she thought that this was going to be her moment, but her label was not supporting her, and you have to, you know, you can't just kind of have an organic moment without your label being willing to put out your singles and push them and promote them. And this is kind of a barrier that women in country music, even when a Black woman is able to kind of work her foot into the door, kind of constantly encounters. So that's why I talk about Reese Palmer, who was an artist that came before Mickey, and she had a song called Country Girl that was released to country radio, really great, kind of perfect for the moment pop country song. But as a Black woman could not, you know, kind of get the institutional support. And Reese looks back to Miko Marks, who was an artist that was another Black female artist who came to Nashville around the same time. You know, could not, again, get the institutional support to make her, you know, career get off the ground. And I think, you know, they were both kind of told that there could only be one Black female artist at a time anyway, so they couldn't both succeed. And you can kind of keep going back down the line, you know, back to Linda Martell and Frankie Staten, of Black women that have had success in country music, only to the degree to which the men around them are comfortable with. And that's, you know, a repetitive pattern that keeps happening and has happened up to Mickey. And I think will keep happening unless Nashville and Music Row is willing to make some kind of fundamental changes. The difference now is that there are some coalitions forming and ways that artists can get their music out that is not dependent on country radio, which gives people, I think, a bit of hope and a way to work around the machinery of Nashville and Music Row.
We touched upon authenticity earlier when discussing patriotic and nationalistic country songs after 9/11. How are Black women not seen as authentic in country music?
Oh, I mean, that's one of the things I think is so interesting to look at with Mickey. She's constantly seen as not being authentic, yet she is from Texas. She grew up kind of playing in the dirt. Her house was, you know, kind of minutes away from the George W. Bush's. And, you know, grew up in the church, woman of faith, you know, all those kind of markers that make an authentic country singer, in quotes. And yet I remember even when Mickey came out with her first single in This was around 2015. It's a pop country song, called Better Than You Left Me. It's just kind of a pure pop country radio song, and a very good one. She sounds beautiful on it. And I remember some of the reviews at the time were like, Mickey Guyton is, a great meeting place between, country music and R&B. And I was like, well, there's no R&B in her voice. It's a country song. But she was labeled kind of immediately as R&B just because she was a black woman. There was nothing sonically. She's a country singer. But I think kind of immediately from stepping foot into Nashville as a black woman, you have to do everything right and play by all the right rules and work so hard to earn any bit of that authenticity cred that men and white women are just kind of instantly endowed with. And that's just kind of an impossible struggle because you're never going to prove you're authentic enough. You're never going to satisfy them because it's never going to be about that,
Though women are still marginalized within country music and really all music, they're still defiant in their advocacy for inclusion. And an example you write about in your book is Follow Your Arrow, a song by Casey Musgraves that had a huge impact on queer representation in country music. Can you share with us how these artists, specifically the women in country music, are elevating the LGBTQ plus community?
Sure, yeah. I mean, Follow Your Arrow is a really important moment to talk about, not just because it sort of has this little, not even super specific reference to, it just says, kiss lots of girls if that's what you're into. It's not super cutting edge. It's just, it's a lyric, but it's inclusive. And she had two queer songwriters that she wrote the song with, Shane McAnally and Brittany Clark. And she was very intentional about bringing them to award shows and making sure they were visible, making sure they came on stage when the song won awards, making sure to always kind of say, I'm the straight woman in this mix, I'm an ally, but who you really need to let in the door are, the queer songwriters that I'm in the room with, and those artists too, and that's kind of the most revolutionary part of that song's life to me, not just what it said, but the fact that she was working really hard to bring other people into the room with her. And that's what I think women are really working on doing kind of furiously now, is not just sort of being an ally in speech, but being an ally in action. So in, writing with queer songwriters, bringing them on tour with them, diversifying their crew, their touring crew, their band. And I'm seeing that happen a lot, and that's kind of the most exciting thing to see happen, because it's taking it just from words to actual practice and tangible change.
At the end of your book, you write about moving to Nashville from New York and your decade of experience writing about country music and your interactions with many of the people you discuss in your book. What changes have you seen for women in country since arriving in Nashville?
It's a complicated question because the representation on country radio is still just as bad as it always was. Unless you sing a duet with a man, then you can get your song played. That's a bit of a trick now, and I guess that's one way to go about it. But I have seen, even just shifts in terms of, to look at Maren Morris, kind of the agency that women have felt that they can take and own in country music. I mean, Maren Morris is so outspoken, and actually gets some play on country radio. So it's kind of in this position of having the most to lose in terms of, she is one of the chosen few that will get played on country radio. But she decided that, she's willing to take that gamble by speaking out for what she believes in. And I think that's created a really important, it's kind of emboldened in a very good way women to speak their mind and to speak up for what they believe in. And to form coalitions with other women or queer artists, coalitions of Black country artists. All of these groups are forming to go outside of the system. There's this group called Black Opry, which is a touring collective of Black country artists, which is just kind of growing this incredible kind of, country music always calls itself a family. I think that's a little bold, but something like Black Opry is creating an actual kind of family and ecosystem for people that always felt left out and left behind of the genre that they love, that they never thought loved them back. And those are the real changes I think that I've seen, is just these kind of, coalition building and figuring out ways to not try to change Music Row and country radio, because at this point I don't know if it will ever change, but to go build something entirely new.
So what do you see for women in country in the coming years, especially as we consider what social media and online communities can do to deconstruct more traditional media outlets?
And I think they'll continue to use these unconventional ways in communities to reach more and more fans. And again, I don't think it will shift country radio. I hope I'm wrong. But I do think it will start to shift future generations in terms of who feels like owns country music, who is country music for. If you are able to go on streaming or wherever you get your music and discover that there are artists singing about, there's you find a non-binary country artist and they're singing your story to you, you're going to change how you feel about this genre that maybe you thought, completely dismissed your life experience. And that is, that's kind of what keeps me going, I guess. I kind of hope that so many more people will feel let in to this genre and feel like they own it too, that it's also theirs, that they can use it to sing their truths to, future generations and so on and so forth. And that's definitely, I think, the kind of the positives that I see in the shifts. So less about any kind of holding out hope for, mainstream country radio, but definitely feeling hopeful about, Allison Russell calls it the Rainbow Coalition, for the artists in those communities to, just kind of keep exponentially growing.
So my final question for you would be, who are some up-and-coming women, transgender, or non-binary artists in country that you would like to shout out and boost?
Oh gosh, there's so many. I feel like I should have like a list in front of me. But some folks I'm really loving right now are Brittany Spencer, Kelsey Walden, Emily Scott Robinson, a deemed artist. There's Leah Blevins. There's so many. It's sometimes hard to sit down and even remember all of them. But any of those artists could lead you down a great, wormhole. If you go find Black Opry, the sheer amount of talent that is in their touring coalition. I discovered this artist, Autumn Nichols, through Black Opry, and I was just absolutely floored with how talented they are. And it kind of is mind-blowing how much incredible talent there is outside of the mainstream. So, yeah, it's there if you're just willing to look. And it isn't, luckily these days it's not even that difficult. And you latch on to someone that you love, like a Margot Price or Reese Palmer or Maren Morris, and see who they're touring with, and see who they're bringing on. They're tweeting, and see who they're talking about, and everyone's kind of really, putting themselves in the ring to fight for this together and lift each other up, and that's a really good thing.
Marissa, thank you for joining me today. This was a great conversation. I had a lot of fun.
Thank you for having me. Those are great questions.
Of course, I'm happy to have you. And I just want to say, to write a book that bucks against a major industry and does so with deeply rich cultural and social context is an incredibly hard thing to do. And you accomplished that admirably with your book, and you should be incredibly proud. It's a fantastic book.
Oh gosh, thank you. You're gonna make me cry now. That's really nice of you to say. Thank you.
My name is Bradley Morgan, and you've been listening to New Books and Music with my guest today, Marissa R. Moss. Her book is Her Country, How the Women of Country Music Became the Success They Were Never Supposed to Be, and is published by Henry Holt & Company.
Hello and welcome to the History Extra podcast from BBC History Magazine, Britain's best-selling history magazine. I'm Ellie Cawthorne. Old English is full of linguistic gems, many of which we would recognise in our speech patterns today, and others which have been long lost. In her new book, The Word Hoard, Daily Life in Old English, Dr. Hannah Vadine opens up this linguistical treasure chest and reveals what Old English tells us about life at the time it was spoken. Our content director, David Musgrove, spoke to her to find out more, and began by asking about where and when Old English was spoken, and who exactly was speaking it.
So Old English was spoken from around 550 to 1150 roughly in what's now England. It was a language that came from immigrants from Northern Europe, and so sort of Northern Europe, Northern Germany and the Netherlands. So those various languages became what we now call Old English in England, sort of in the early medieval period.
And did it replace a pre-existing language in England?
We don't really know if it replaced it per se, but because we have very little in terms of written records from the earliest time. There would have been people speaking Latin, probably left over from when the Romans occupied Britain, but we don't know exactly how many people were speaking which languages in that very early period. It's a very sort of fuzzy time period, but we start getting records that are in Old English centuries after the migration would have taken place.
Okay, and when we're talking about Celtic languages, those would have been in play probably in Britain.
Yeah, in addition to Latin, you would have the languages that would eventually become Welsh and Gaelic, sort of those early Celtic languages. So they were spoken in Ireland and Scotland and Wales. What is now Ireland, Scotland, and Wales.
Okay, so a complicated picture and a little bit hard to untangle, but gives us a sense about. And what about Old Norse, that language? That was that was a similar sort of language. Was that spoken at the same time, or was that mutually intelligible to Old English speakers?
Yeah, Old English and Old Norse were spoken around the same time, ever since Norse settlers and raiders started coming over to England, that would have been a language that they would have been familiar with. There's been some work on whether they were mutually intelligible, and it seems like they were to a certain extent. Interpreters probably would not have been needed, but it didn't necessarily mean that people could speak both Old English and Old Norse, but they could get on well enough with each other in daily life that they'd be able to understand each other.
Okay. Now, one of the things that I found very interesting in the introduction to your book, and quite surprising, was where you talked about just exactly how much surviving written text in Old English we have to go on. And it sounds like it's not very much. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so the linguist David Crystal, I think, phrased it as being around 30 novels length of texts that we have in Old English. So it's about a bit over 3 million words of Old English, and some of those texts they're multiple copies of a text. So we'll have several manuscripts with the same text written, the way we have books now with the same text written in many books. But the number is counting sort of how many words they're like sort of unique sets of words that we have in Old English.
When you go back to Old English, how easy is it to make it out, to understand it? If you're coming at it completely fresh as a modern English speaker, can you understand any of it?
It really depends on the text you're looking at. So if you're looking at the later texts that are more prosaic, like chronicles and stuff, you might be able to make it out a bit easier. For instance, if I say the sentence, Hana is min nama, you might be able to figure that out as Hana is my name. It wouldn't be so strange to you. But then if you read the first, several lines of Beowulf, they go, Huat, we gardena and yer dagum, and that might be less comprehensible to you. So for the most part, you need to have studied Old English grammar and vocabulary to have a handle on it.
Can you just tell us what Huat means? Because that's a very sort of archetypal Old English word, isn't it? The starting word of Beowulf.
Yes, so Huat it's where our word what comes from. So it's just the H and the W swapping places. And there's been a lot of discussion on what it means. Translators of Beowulf have translated it in many different ways, including hark, listen, lo, oh, what, hey, all kinds of things. But it's basically a word that gets your attention at the beginning of telling a story, in the case of Beowulf.
And does that tell us that Beowulf was written to be read aloud then? Is that sort of leading that conversation?
Well, it was probably an oral story for some time before it was written down. So for whatever, we don't know what purpose the scribe had in writing down Beowulf, but it probably existed as a story for like maybe centuries before that was written down.
Does Old English change much over time? You mentioned that it's the period we're talking about is from about 550 through to 1100. That's quite a long time, quite a long period. Are there marked differences between the start and end of that story?
Well, it's a bit tricky because most of the manuscripts that we have that contain Old English are from the later period. The earliest texts that we have in Old English survive as runic inscriptions, so they're very short. We don't have a whole lot to go by, and there isn't any substantial writing in Old English until Roman missionaries arrive in the 6th century. But then there's actually fewer than 10 manuscripts of Old English that have substantial material before the 10th century. So when we're looking at what Old English looked like earlier in the period, it's a bit difficult to say. There might be texts that survive from them, but they've been recorded by people in later centuries that might be following different sort of different grammar, using different vocabulary. But broadly speaking, it becomes less reliant on on word endings, so inflection as time goes on, and the word order becomes a bit more familiar to us.
Now, one of the fun things in your book, the things that I've really enjoyed, and I suppose what marks out as different from other titles, is the way you try and help us understand society and daily life in the period through the sorts of words that were being used. I wonder, there's a few areas I'd like to discuss specifically, but before we do that, I wonder, there's a sort of general questions. You talked about the poetry that we have, the surviving poems that we have, The Wanderer, The Ruin, Beowulf, things like that. Do you get the sense that the speakers of Old English were particularly poetic sorts, or is that simply a reflection of the survival of the corpus that we have?
I suspect that's more a reflection of the corpus we have left. I mean, if everyday speech wasn't recorded as much as it is in our, in society today, we have all kinds of different types of speech being recorded and shared, like on social media and on the news, and just like video recordings of people talking. And so if you're looking back at the year 1000, what we get recorded is what people decided was worth recording, which was quite a process to actually record words. So yeah, what we're going to get is homilies, maybe religious texts, poetry, chronicles, but not so much just what people spoke in everyday conversations. One of the things I refer to in the book is when I'm trying to talk about secular professions, and what we don't have very many words for describing the secular professions, like outside of the church. And there's this kind of student dialogue that has survived that a Latin teacher wrote for his students. It has Latin, but it also has Old English translations of the Latin in it, and it has phrases like, well, what do you do, farmer? And the farmer says, oh, I have to get up and work and go to the fields, and my Lord is going to be mad at me if I don't do it. But it's the sort of conversation that you get in a language textbook where, when I took Spanish in school, we'd have these conversations that felt very kind of outside of what normal people would be saying to each other, but it was a learning, kind of a learning method. It feels like everything that's written down is perhaps, it's written down for a reason, and it isn't just reflecting what people say in everyday life.
I got it. You're talking about Aelfrich's colloquies there. Yeah. So they're kind of one little way in, just a little scintilla of insight there. What about humour? Can we see how they express humour through the writings that you've seen?
Yeah. Well, humor is another difficult thing, because what we find funny today might not have been considered funny then. There's nothing that says specifically like this was satire, or this was a joke book, or something like that. But I think one thing that we can say for pretty certain that it was supposed to be funny on some level are the riddles of the Exeter book, which are from the 10th century. And there's a series of riddles. They don't have solutions, and they're objects or things speaking in the first person, and you're meant to guess what that object is. And there's a lot of double entendre with those. There's perhaps different ways you could read them that could be sort of naughty or not naughty, and that's some of the humor that we can see in Old English.
Okay, and then before we move on, the title of your book it includes the word hoard. What is a word hoard?
A word hoard. Word hoard is a word that appears 7 times in Old English. It's always used in poetry, and it describes a poet's stockpile of words and phrases that they would draw on. So if you're a poet and you're reciting from memory, it would be useful to have some words and phrases back of your head to sort of pull out and throw in while you're trying to tell a long story. And so that's the idea of what the word hoard is having this supply of useful language at hand.
And you draw on this supply as you go through the book to try and illustrate some themes of social history, as I've mentioned earlier. So shall we dive in and talk about food and eating?
Sure.
So what can we learn about the sort of food that people ate from the surviving words? Can we take a stab at what were the main staples of the diet, for instance?
Yeah, well, bread usually accompanied by something else. The word bread appears in Old English, which is where we get the word bread from, but it actually means something more like food in the text. But we have the word hlav, which means it's where we get our word loaf, but it would have been bread. And I guess maybe you can get a feel for the importance of bread from the words we get for lord and lady, which, if you look at the kind of Old English origins of these words, hlavwerd it means bread keeper or bread guardian, and that's what turned into the word lord, which is obviously an important word to us today and was at the time as well. So you get an idea of how significant bread was, certainly.
Okay, so bread is at one stage a sort of a fairly generic word for food generally.
Yes.
Does meat have the same meaning as we have today, or is that a broader definition back in the Old English period?
Yeah, and so there are a lot of words like this in Old English where they look like they're pretty much the same as what we know now, but then you look into it more and it's actually a little different. So meta looks like our word meat, but it would have referred to food in general. It didn't used to be as specific as, flesh from an animal. It could have been just food.
Can we learn anything about meal times from looking at the surviving words? Can you tell us anything about when meals were eaten?
Yeah, we really know mainly about when meals were eaten for like people of the church, because that was the people of the church would have had prescribed times of day when they do prayer and when they are able to have food and stuff. So we do get words in Old English like undermete, which is something that I talk about a bit, and undern refers to the morning and meta is food. So on the surface it looks like it would just mean breakfast, but it doesn't appear in text that would really describe what everyday people in early medieval England would be doing. It appears as a translation for words in biblical sources, so it looks like a word for breakfast, but whether it was actually used as a word for breakfast by ordinary people is sort of something we don't really know. The main meal of the day was probably not at breakfast time. It was because you would wanted to get, if you're a farmer, you'd want to get an early start, get to work as soon as the sun is up. So maybe you'd have a meal sort of midday. That would have been your main meal, and then maybe something later in the day before bed. But yeah, you wouldn't have like bacon and eggs and beans and toast sort of first thing in the morning.
Can we talk a bit about dairy produce? What would be why would you want your milk to be skinked, for instance?
So yes, so the word schenkon is just, it means to pour, and its meaning has changed over the years. So schenkon in Old English is just pouring out a liquid, but over time it came to mean pouring out alcohol specifically. And yeah, as you were saying, it comes to be pronounced skink instead of schenk. So yeah, that word appears in the Leech books, so the medical texts of Old English, where is giving simple instructions on how to make something. So it says, heat a shank of milk and use that for your preparation. It's a very practical term.
Still to come on the History Extra podcast.
Waverganga, which is one of my favorites, it means weaver walker, and so you think, what animal would that be, a weaver walker? And it's a spider, and it's such a delightful way to describe a spider. It makes me like spiders more, just having that word exist.
And what about Cheese Week? You talk about Cheese Week in your book, which is a fascinating concept for a cheese enthusiast like myself. Was there such a thing?
So the word I talk about is cheesewood, and that is something that has been thought to mean Cheese Week because of the way it's spelled. It looks like maybe it could be the same as Chusa, which is cheese. It's the week following the last Sunday before Lent. So it's been suggested it was the last week that cheese would have been allowed before Lent, but it doesn't really make sense because it was true that medieval Christians would have been permitted to consume cheese on the Monday and Tuesday before Lent, but according to the sermon where the word appears, Cheesewood appears, it's actually the first 4 days of Lent, so it begins on Ash Wednesday. So that doesn't make sense because presumably then that would be when your fasting starts. So what people have theorized is that maybe it actually means there's a word that is very similar to cheese that means something like choosy or sort of being particular about what you're eating. And so perhaps it could even refer to a time when you're being a bit choosy about, like, you're fasting, you're limiting what you eat. So it wouldn't be Cheese Week, it would be Choosy Week, which sounds kind of sad because it is a nice idea to have a cheese week, but really if that would mean that your intake of cheese was limited to just 1 week of the year, that would be pretty sad too. So I guess it works out.
And staying on cheese, there's an interesting bit in your book about how you might prove guilt by cheese. Can you explain that?
Yeah, so there's a word that appears several times in Old English that's korsnad, and it's one of it's listed along with some different ordeals that you could undergo to prove someone's guilt. The other ones are perhaps more what you might expect. So it's like putting your hand and picking something up out of boiling water and then seeing how that heals afterwards, or even, putting someone in a pool of water and seeing whether they sink or float or that sort of thing. So those you might have heard of before. The korsnad is a bit weird because it just involves putting like an ounce of bread and cheese in your mouth, and if you choke, then you're guilty, and if you don't, then you're okay. So it's kind of hard to imagine that being a thing that would happen a lot, that you would choke on your bread and cheese. It's a strange trial. There's been a lot sort of written on that, different ideas of what that could refer to, but I think what I find the most convincing is that this was a trial that was meant for specifically for a priest in the church. So it would have been someone for whom taking an oath would be quite a serious deal, and so perhaps it was more symbolic of the way you take communion and how that would somehow go. Again, like you'd be in danger of hellfire if you were sort of misusing the communion or misusing korsnad in a way when you're making an oath about whether you've committed a crime or not. So it could be more of a psychological thing, as when you're maybe when you're nervous, like you have trouble eating something, but we don't really know, and we also don't really know if this trial was used at all, or if it was just written down by a couple people in our law books. And yeah, so we don't really know how prominent this trial was, but it is an interesting word, and it's interesting that it survives in what we have left of Old English.
Okay, should we move on to time, because that's another a section in your book about understanding of time for Old English speakers. Just sort of kick us off. How was time measured in the early medieval period? There are obviously no wristwatches. How were people sort of aware of the passing of time? Do we know?
Yeah, I mean, we don't actually have a word for hour in English until like Middle English, so that's a later period. So people were not really measuring time certainly not in minutes, but not even in hours. So probably people would be referring to different times of day based on where the sun is. We have a lot of words for sort of when the sun is just rising, or in the morning or evening, or things like that, but we don't have words to refer to 3 p.m. or something. Another interesting thing about time shows up in Leech books, so the medical texts. So there are some of the instructions on how to make different remedies will tell you to stir something and say the Lord's Prayer like 3 times or something. And this might seem on the surface as more of a religious thing, like maybe you need to recite these words in order for the remedy to work, but it also could be a way of measuring time, because that would be a pretty standard measurement if everyone knows the Lord's Prayer, and you know that it would take a certain period of time to say it. There is a really lovely word I like that's Egan Brutum, which means eye twinkle. So I guess that maybe could be a word that talks about a very short period of time. The word bepriwan means to wink, and there's a word preotwheel, which has been translated as sort of the time it takes for someone to wink. So that, I guess, could be a very short amount of time.
So chunking up a bit in terms of periods of time, days of the week. Do we have the same days of the week now as they did in the early medieval period? As those words survived down to us?
Yeah, those words have stayed pretty much the same. They were named for different deities, so they were mainly named for deities of Northern Europe as opposed to Roman deities, which is why if you look at a lot of Romance languages, the words for the days of the week are not very much like our days of the week. But for instance, we have Wednesday, which is Wednesday, and that word comes from Woden, or Odin, who's a god of Northern Europe, like pagans, so that's where that word comes from. And the other days of the week are similar. They come from Frigg and Tyr and Thor.
And can we make any observations on how people felt about days of the week from the way they're called? Did they mean anything more to them then? I mean, you think about Woden's Day today. Obviously, we don't have, there's probably not many listeners who would actively be celebrating Woden or Odin, but so for speakers of Old English, where perhaps there was closer to the religions that were being talked about, did they have more meaning? I suppose is what I'm wondering about.
For pretty much the whole Old English period, people would have been mostly Christian. So I think that the people who are talking about Woden's Day wouldn't necessarily be thinking of, yes, the day that we worship Woden, but perhaps there'd be more of an immediate connection that you'd make just because you more people would have been familiar with that, but I'm not sure really how much your sort of everyday person would be aware of pagan deities of Northern Europe, because that wouldn't be part of your daily life.
Just thinking about months now, so are the months of the year broadly similar to what we have now in terms of the naming conventions?
They're quite different, actually. We get some interesting month names that some of them are a little bit more familiar, like you talk about Yale, sort of Yule, although in Old English there was sort of first Yule and second Yule, and that referred to the months of December and January. But yeah, the rest of the month names are quite different. Like one of my favorites is Three Milcha Monad, which is Three Milkings Month, which is a very peculiar sort of sounding name, and it refers to the month of May. And people have theorized that maybe this was because there was the pasturing was so abundant, and like you could have your cows giving you milk 3 times a day or something like that, but we really don't know where these names come from. A lot of the Old English month names are a bit of a puzzle. Another month that is very much related to agriculture is August, which is Wead Monad, which means weed month. And I guess the idea there would be that that's a month where you have to do a lot of weeding. So you have, and then you have months like Sol Monad, which, depending on how you translate it, could either mean sunny month or muddy month. And given that it's February, you can probably guess that it was muddy month.
Well, that's an excellent segue into my last section on weather. But before we started recording this, my opening gambit to you was to start talking about the weather, which is obviously a preoccupation of people in Britain, certainly. Can we sort of make a stab at whether speakers of Old English in the early medieval period were similarly preoccupied?
I mean, weather would have definitely been very important, probably more important in a way, because if you're doing a lot of your work outside, as you would if you're a farmer, and most of the population would be doing some sort of farming, so it would have been more important in a way. Because we don't really have any conversations recorded of what everyday people were saying to each other, we don't know how much people talked about the weather then, but it certainly comes up in poetry and in the chronicles and in all sorts of sources. So yeah, it was probably similarly important to them. The word weather is actually wedder in Old English, so it's very similar. But something I find really fascinating is that there's a word that's unwedder, and so that's like the negation of weather. And when we talk about weather today, we usually are, maybe it's just people in the UK. When people in the UK talk about weather, it's usually some sort of negative thing. It's usually referring to bad weather specifically. But in Old English, there's a word that specifically means bad weather, and that's unwedder. And weather on its own is not bad, so it could refer to a sunny day or beautiful weather, something that you would appreciate a bit more.
What was a weather token?
Yeah, so that's another example, because I think when I first heard of weather token, I thought that it would be a token of weather would be something bad, like a storm cloud or something, but it actually, so weather token in the context that it appears in, it actually is referring to a sign of good weather. So maybe a sun, like brilliant sunshine or something like that.
So, okay, you've answered my question. Did they have words for good weather? It sounds like they did. They did speak about good weather as much as bad weather.
Yeah, there's a lot of words to describe good weather, especially when, there's a lot of writing about paradise. So imagining what paradise looks like, and you get these wonderful words like sunliti, which means sun beautiful, and sort of words like leavshadu, which is leaf shade. So you're imagining sitting in a beautiful sunny garden with maybe some delicate rays of sun filtering through the leaves, and it's very beautiful, although it does appear in poetry about paradise. So how much that was something that you'd experienced in daily life, I don't know.
Well, it sounds nice, but Britain is, of course, famously grey and rainy, so I presume that they did have lots of words for clouds and rain.
Yeah, there's some words like wolkenjanast, which means like cloud collision, which is a great way to talk about stormy weather, and the rushing of clouds, and yeah. So there's a lot of, and there are a lot of words to describe icy, cold weather as well.
So we've covered food, we've covered time, we've covered weather. There's lots of other sections in your book that you look into various different aspects of sort of social life in the period. I'm just wanting to wrap up though. And as a scholar of an old English yourself, do you find in your when you're chatting to people, when you write, that you're constantly mashing up words like they did and putting two words together?
I don't know that I do that, but I mean, there's so many words that I wish that we still used now, because they're especially animal words like hrathamus means adorned mouse, and that's such an adorable word to describe a bat. And waverganga, which is one of my favorites, it means weaver walker, and so you think, what animal would that be, a weaver walker? And it's a spider, and it's such a delightful way to describe a spider. It makes me like spiders more, just having that word exist.
Dr. Hannah Vadine, thank you very much for your time. That was a fascinating insight into the world of Old English. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
Reported for the 7 days to 4 p.m. Thursday. A man's been charged with possessing illegal firearms and drugs at Toongabbie in Sydney's west. Police say they found a rifle hidden in a kitchen and more than $10,000 cash during a raid. The 21-year-old, who's charged with 9 offences, is due to face court today. The state opposition is promising to fast-track completion of the Parramatta Light Rail if it wins the March state election. Labor's promising to spend an extra $200 million to finalise the project. Shadow Transport Minister Joe Halen says it's long overdue.
The Liberals have announced this project 16 times since 2014 without actually lifting a finger to start construction. Labor will ensure that we start construction in our first term.
A teenager has died in a single-car crash at Orange in the Central West. Emergency crews called to Coronation Drive just before 1 o'clock this morning say a car hit a tree. A 17-year-old boy was airlifted to Sydney in a critical condition but died a short time later. The 17-year-old boy driving and a 14-year-old girl in the back seat were not injured. The president of RSL Australia says poker machines in RSL clubs are doing more harm than good. Greg Mellick says he supports a New South Wales government plan to mandate cashless gaming to reduce gambling harm. He's threatened to split from the RSL and Services Clubs Association, which is campaigning with Clubs New South Wales against reform.
I'm also aware that money from poker machines assists government to a considerable extent, and also a lot of charities benefit from money from poker machines. But my opinion is overall the damage caused outweighs the good.
Prince Harry says his brother William physically attacked him during an argument, one of the many allegations in his new ghost-written memoir titled Spare. Our Europe correspondent Nick Dole reports.
He grabbed me by the collar, ripping my necklace, and he knocked me to the floor. It's just one of the allegations in the Prince's new book, which has somehow found its way onto shelves in Spain. He also claims William and Kate actively encouraged him to go to a party in 2005 dressed as a Nazi. He says William's been both his beloved brother and his arch nemesis. Both he and William begged his father not to marry Camilla, he says, and while he believes she makes him happy, He's accused the Queen Consort of leaking stories to the press. Nick Dole, ABC News, London.
Australia has 475 runs with 6 wickets remaining in the rain-delayed test against South Africa at the SCG. Play is yet to resume on day 3, also known as the Pink Day, where supporters are encouraged to wear pink to honour Jane McGrath, the late wife.
Operam, which is of course Latin for Achtung, Achtung. I mean, honestly, talk about scraping the linguistic barrel. This week in 19...
I don't think we've had it before, though, have we?
No, we haven't, though. We haven't. It's our Vero. We have not had it before. It was used to puzzle me because why didn't you will have done Latin at school?
Yeah. Kaiser had some jam fatigue, Pompey had a right.
Yeah, exactly. All that. Yeah, exactly. Because we always used to sort of. That was always one of the sort of facts about Latin, was the fact there was no word for yes. You sort of think itar vero is meant to be yes. How can a language not have a word for yes? Just
well, what do you think they did? Just nodded. They just did that.
They had a word for yes. They had a word for yes. It's just schoolboy Latin was a nonsense. Anyway, I've got that off my chest.
Definitely that.
40 years it's taken me.
Latin primer. Do you remember that little Latin primer?
The slave called Britannicus to make us feel like we were connected to the whole thing. Oh, I can relate to the slave because he's from Britain and he's called Britannicus.
My favourite Asterix is Asterix in Britain. It's just sublime genius.
Yeah, it's brilliant, isn't it? It's brilliant.
What is it? Your Rome may be larger than my garden, but my pilum is stronger than your sternum. Genius.
The colonel. When I was a kid, he used to regularly have to go to France for work, and he'd always bring an asterisk back with him in French.
That'll test you.
Well, the idea being that that would improve my French. So what I used to do was at school, I'd get hold of the English translation and basically learn it.
The cheat. Have you ever fessed up?
I think he knew. He busted me at the time. I'm certain he busted me at the time. Because so much of it's colloquial. I'd come up with an English. I'd come up with the Anthea Bell or whatever her name was. Translation. Anyway, this week in 1945, Adolf Hitler ordered a scorched earth policy across West Germany to slow down advancing Allied forces. This became known as the Nero Decree, after the man who infamously let Rome burn in 64 AD with Hitler in his bunker. Albert Speer claims he chose not to implement the Führer's decree. Let's not forget, we only have Speer's word for any of those encounters, don't we?
Yeah. There were people, though, who were hurrying up to the salt mines at Altazane, desperately trying to stop them all the artwork being destroyed. So that did happen.
That did, but the infamous Speer meetings with Hitler, the one-on-one meetings he had right at the end, we've only got Speer's word for what happened, and Speer was working awfully hard at distancing himself from the fact that he was arguably trying to become one of Hitler's successors right up to the last minute. Anyway, welcome to We Have Ways of Making You Talk with me, Al Murray, and James Holland. And characteristically, we digressed even from the scripted opening sentences.
Well, yes. I mean, it's great to see you because you've had the plague, haven't you?
Yes, Yes, Wednesday. I was feeling very weird on Wednesday, and I thought, I'll take a COVID test just to be sure. And I'd read someone on Twitter saying, you've got to leave it the full quarter of an hour to be absolutely certain. So I did, and I came back, and there's the bloody red line. And then I really was not. Thursday and Friday, I was pretty ropey. I sort of went deaf on Friday.
Yeah. We can still taste.
No, that's interesting. My sense of taste has not been affected, but I've had everything. It's done everything. It's sweats and
yeah. Because when I spoke to you on Saturday, I think you were sweaty.
Really sweating badly. And I couldn't concentrate and all that sort of stuff. Although that has recovered. So I've done my reading.
Yeah, well done. So are you back on the road this week? Is that the plan?
Yeah, we start again. We should be back on the road. Where are we this week? We're in Nottingham.
Nottingham.
No, Nottingham was last week. Which was one that we had to move. We're in Warwick Arts Centre, which is in Coventry, of course. For those who want to be confused, Exeter Great Hall on Saturday, and then we're in Cheltenham on Sunday.
Okay, so a nice triangle.
Yeah, a nice little triangle, and that's 2 shows in Cheltenham, which will put hair on my chest, or remove it all, depending on how fit I am for that. Anyway, we've got some parish notices before Jim and I get stuck into what we want to talk about. In the past week or so, we have Ways HQ have been fighting off a full-scale mutiny by independent company members over the lack of a curry van at We Have Ways Fest 2022. Now, last year the curry van was like a sort of heroic last stand. Where they were almost, it was like Rorke's Drift, the curry van in a way. They were overwhelmed by the numbers, but still held them off heroically, and delivered curries to the curry hungry. Some members have been metaphorically clambering over the wire and around the production compound, such was the angst at the lack of samosas and paneer tikka masala. But today, we can announce late night negotiations in smoke-filled rooms resulted in a breakthrough. Curry will be returning to We Have Ways Fest 2022, which is
yes, but it's not just curry either. I mean, there's a broader range this year. So from an eating point of view, we've got pie and mash as well.
Yeah.
Oven baked pizza. Bread oven, stone baked pizza. That's what we call it. Stone baked pizza. Fish and chips. Yeah. Coffee shops, all the rest of it. And then on the interesting development on the bar front, so not only have we got interesting ales, we've also got a wine bar this time that is also going to be selling Calvados.
Oh dear. Well, I think I know what's going to happen to me. And also the programme is nearly, we nearly put the finishing touches to the programme, although it's subject to change. I think it's a fantastic and varied programme, and we've got some interesting tangents too, I think, to add to what we're trying to do. Put those out like breadcrumbs when we know what they are.
We absolutely
will. Because you sort of get, putting a thing like this together, it sort of gains a critical mass, doesn't it, Jim?
Yeah, it does. I think it's shaping up really, really nicely, and in all its component parts. So we've got 3 venues this time for talks and discussions. But also what we're doing in the arena, I think is sounding really, really good. And if I just give a little hint, which is kind of all arms operations. Not a battle, but seeing them moving moving into position and then moving forward. I think it'll be amazing to see a kind of troopers, Shermans with infantry, with artillery, with reconnaissance vehicles, all together as they would have been in Normandy 1944. I think that's going to be pretty exciting.
That's what we're aiming at, isn't it? That's what we're trying to achieve.
That's what we're trying to do. Yeah.
Also, today we are launching Kit Off 22. For those of you who don't know, this is a modelling competition. We did one in the height of the pandemic, with people sending in their models, which was great fun. So this year, what we're doing is all proceeds are going to the DEC Relief Fund, helping people suffering in Ukraine. The rules are really simple, and we want loads of you to get involved. You can spend a maximum of £30 on a kit. It's £10 to enter, and all proceeds are going to help the people of Ukraine. I'm also going to, because I've got a burgeoning stash of unmade stuff, I'm going to put a couple of kits into the stash as well, which we'll do on Twitter at some point. It's £10 to enter. All proceeds are going to help the people of Ukraine. The deadline to send pictures of your final model build is the 31st of May using the hashtag KITOFF, KITOFF, on Twitter. Entries will be judged by Jim and I, but more importantly by Simon from Red 5 Models, who is the podcast's official modelling expert and a tremendous fellow to boot. More information can be found on our Twitter account this week at We Have Ways Pod. And we've got some really exciting prizes planned, so please do get involved.
There's going to be a few AFVs being pulled by tractors.
If you can get the 2 kits for under £30, yeah, absolutely. You're only allowed to spend 30 quid per kit, because otherwise we'll have this appalling sort of accelerationist thing with people spending a fortune. It's all for people in Ukraine who obviously evidently need our help. Now we've a message from Canada. We received this extraordinary message from a listener in Alberta, Canada. She calls herself Country Dreamer on Twitter, and here's what she said about an event called If Day. Now, I'd not heard of this. Hi, James and Al. I enjoy listening to your podcast. Back in 1942, February the 19th, there was a mock Nazi invasion in Winnipeg, Manitoba, Canada. It was quite realistic and was done to sell bonds. The prairies in Canada were homesteaded by large numbers of Germans, mostly Mennonite and Hutterite. Unfortunately, this event did not help with the prejudice towards anyone of German ancestry. I can imagine not. Bloody hell. My grandmother is from the Manitoba German community. While she does not remember If Day, as she was too young, she does remember anti-German sentiment. They were no longer able to speak the language. Some chose to change their names to be English sounding. Their phone lines were tapped. Gosh, the phone lines were tapped because the Nazis were trying to infiltrate Canada's Mennonite communities. Unfortunately, a few families did return to Germany to support the Reich from the subject. However, there was a lot of hatred towards anyone from the German communities, some even ending up in labour camps. Most of the Canadian Germans wanted to live peaceably and had been living in Canada for decades at this point with no ties to Nazism. I was thinking we'd make an interesting topic for you. This If Day is controversial in Canadian history. I don't know if there was everything like that in the UK. They did, I think, do it in some terms in the US. I think it's relevant to our present times with anti-Russian sentiment. This will make an interesting discussion. I should point out that in 1942 they did put warnings out in the newspapers ahead of time. However, in the poor surrounding communities, these people who spoke little English were very poor. Seeing a plane with a swastika flying around and Nazi officers marching through gave them quite a fright. It's amazing none of the actors got shot. That's from Country Dreamer in Alberta. I've not heard of that. That's extraordinary.
No. Amazing.
Pretty improbable, the idea that the Germans would invade Canada. I mean, that's your what if run amok, isn't it? Really.
It is, but I mean, if you're seeing sort of planes with swastikas lying around and people speaking German in German uniforms with weapons and stuff, are you going to stop and go, oh, rubbish? That's unlikely.
Yeah.
You're just going to go, holy moly, the Nazis have arrived, aren't you?
Yeah, I suppose. Yeah. It's an interesting sort of propaganda. I mean, in a way, a weird way, that reminds me of Orson Welles' War of the Worlds thing.
Yeah.
Although there's debate about whether that did cause a panic or whether that was hype at the time. Orson Welles was good at
doctoring.
Yes, Orson Welles was good at hype.
He was very, very good at that. Went the Day Well, that was another one, wasn't it?
Well, that's a movie. That's a movie.
That's a movie, but he was it's
Thor heard with a bring gun. That's what that is. Yeah, it's fantastic.
Yeah.
Now,
and they discovered they were German, didn't they? Because of the lines through the Seven.
That's right.
Which I've always done, but I'm not German.
Yeah.
Just always done it.
You'd be thrown in jail as a fifth columnist now. What are you doing? What are you doing in here, Holland? Oh, I put a cross on one of my S's, old chap.
Yes, and I know allowed him with you.
No, I knew you with a pun.
But we thought we'd talk about logistics today, didn't we?
I mean, I'm sorry. I've been in full digression mode today. Maybe it's because I'm out from my sick bed. Life is good.
No, well, I'm just so happy to see you in good form. I mean, it's great. Back to your normal old self.
Yeah.
Well, I thought logistics would be interesting to talk about because obviously a couple of weeks ago we talked about the encirclement of Kyiv, and then last week we talked about the capture of parts of Ukraine and the Geneva battles and all the rest of it. And I was thinking, one of the interesting features about what is going on at the moment is, of course, there's a logistical failures by the Russians. And actually, logistics is it's that point, isn't it, that when we're assessing other nations' militaries or other organisations' militaries, we tend to talk in terms of tanks and jets and numbers of and SAMs and nuclear warheads and troops on the ground and all the rest of it. But what we don't do is actually analyse whether they've got capacity to use those and how and what their logistic base is. And I think
we're not the first people who have done that after all. Because the thing you directed me to read last week was this extraordinary book about Barbarossa.
Yes.
Operation Barbarossa and Germany's defeat in the East.
By David
Starr.
I'm obsessed with this guy. I'm absolutely obsessed with him. Also, I've been in email contact with him. He's really nice.
Really?
Yeah, he's really nice.
Right,
He's a really good bloke. We've got to get him on at some point.
It's fascinating
Isn't
because
it?
we'll talk about what we think in a minute. But he lays out his stall. He basically says no one's really had a proper sniff around the planning for Barbarossa
or its execution.
First of all, the planning, and then the execution.
Yeah.
The historiography is meagre, and has also been subject to the sort of buffeting waves of post-war German historiography, post-war Soviet historiography, which sort of moved it in all sorts of directions. And he said, and then NATO historiography, of course. And he basically kind of says, First of all, he says, we're not going to give you any of the Russian side of this at all. This is a book about the German planning. So whatever the state of the Russians isn't the point. It's what the Germans think the state of the Russians is, which is absolutely fascinating. And I also think what's really interesting as well is we've talked about Adam Tooze and Adam Tooze's idea that it's economic pressures that force Germany into making the decisions they make, and he kind of takes that on and goes, well, I don't know about that, and I think that's really, really interesting, because he sort of says basically Barbarossa is this incredible piece of doublethink where the Germans think the way to make sure that the British don't have the Soviets on their side to win this war, because they know that the appraisal is basically, if the British can get the Soviets in, the British are waiting to get the Soviets in. They're trying to get the Soviets and the Americans in any way they can. So the way to make sure the Soviets don't come into the war is to knock them out of the war, is to involve them in the war. And you'll knock them over, because that'll be easy, which is so much of how the thinking goes. And that'll be all right. That'll be fine. They're rubbish.
Yeah, they're Slavs as well, and they're Untermenschen.
They're Slavs, and they're Untermenschen, and their army's crap, and it's been purged, and all this sort of stuff. Which Stahl basically says hangs in the account more than actually how, say, the Soviets are doing in Finland or any of that. It's more to do with a general attitude and old attitudes that even predate Bolshevism
of underestimating.
Yeah, exactly. But this idea though that the way you make sure Britain doesn't get what it wants, which is the Soviets being involved in the war, is to involve the Soviets in the war. It's like you're like. This is the level of thinking that's going on at the heart of it, and it's not just Hitler who thinks this. It's Halder. It's all sorts of people.
Yeah.
They're all completely on board.
Well, and all the planning teams in the OKW, and I think one has to understand that the OKW, although it's incredibly sensible to have a combined services general staff, and the OKW is the Oberkommando of Wehrmacht is the first one. It's not a combined forces. It's not a combined forces general staff. It is the mouthpiece of Hitler. But the people who are doing his bidding, particularly at this stage of the war, are completely into the whole thing.
Yeah.
And on that logistics thing, I mean, the whole German way of war. This idea that you smash your enemy very, very hard at the point of impact, the Schwerpunkt, and then you surround them and annihilate them very, very quickly. That is completely inbuilt. I mean that's Prussian all the way back to the 18th century. It's what they did in the first, but it's what they did in the First World War if they got the chance. Yes, so it is absolutely part of what they do.
Yeah.
And it works obviously brilliantly in 1940, but key to what they do in 1940, and I'm absolutely going to come straight back to 1941, but I think 1940 is really, really interesting, because in 1940. KCL, the attack on the West, absolutely inbuilt to every part of the tactical plan, are logistics, and the logistical plan, and for the spearheads, which obviously, let's say the number one spearhead is Panzer Group Kleist, which includes Guderian's 19 Corps, with 1st Panzer, 10 Panzer, and 2 Panzer. Absolutely kind of working out the logistics to keep that speed going up, 3 days to the Meuse, a crossing 4 and all the rest of it, and then keep it going beyond with. It's worked out absolutely to the nth degree. Everything, this is the rucksack principle, the backpack principle, that you take everything with you. I mean, that's almost sort of deep battle. And you have lorries with huge numbers of jerry cans who are going down the road and kind of handing out. So when you run out of fuel, the fuel lorry's convoy comes down alongside you, hands over jerry cans so you can all refuel at the same time. You then dump them off your empties at a certain point. They're then collected again, taken back to the rear dump, filled up again, on you go. Every single bit of that is kind of worked out in the finest detail. And it works because the distances aren't great, and even in the Ardennes, the roads are quite good. And once they get to, and the distance they're trying to travel from the German border, and obviously in the build-up to getting to the German border from within Germany, that's not a problem, because you can have as many fuel dumps as you want, and you can have a whole stash of fuel dumps right on the Luxembourg-Belgian border, because you can, because it's German territory, so there's no issue with that. And then once you go through, the distances are actually, to the Meuse from the German border, it's like 120 miles, something like that. It's a decent amount, but it's perfectly okay. But once you then get across the Meuse and you're then charging pell-mell to the Channel coast, it's France. So you've got lots of good roads, and because France is so automotive, you've got lots of petrol stations, and you've got all the mechanics that you need to support that. The big difference is that, and what then happens is after that they kind of think, and also, the other thing that's really important is that they are given carte blanche to do what they want. So there's no interference from Hitler at this point. Everything changes by the time they're planning for Barbarossa, because they've done what they've done, it's expected of them, and they've got hubristic, they've got overconfident, they've got complacent, and they have not taken into account the massive differences of fighting in the Soviet Union.
We need to take a quick break now. We'll be back in a second.
Welcome to Acast Recommends. Every week we pick some of our favourite shows, and this is one we think you're gonna love.
Hey, I'm Julian Morgans. You might know me from a show called Extremes, but I'm here to introduce something new. It's called What It Was Like, and I'm asking people who have lived through big, dramatic events what it was like. So, for example, I just interviewed a woman who brought down the serial killer who inspired the film Wolf Creek. She talks about spending an evening alone at the crime scene, in the desert, just to understand what a victim went through. And that's the show. It's all about talking to people who were right there, in the middle of something wild. So listen to What It Was Like, wherever you get your podcasts.
Subscribe to this show and hundreds more now via Acast or wherever you get your podcasts.
Welcome back to We Have Ways of Making You Talk with me, Al Murray, and James Holland, and we are talking about Operation Barbarossa. Why is it that they take doing this seriously in France? It's because the French in the First World War stopped the Prussian way of war working. They defeated them, essentially. Because if the point is you do it with manoeuvre and encirclements, the French actually had a solution to that. So they're taking the French really, really, really seriously.
Yes.
By planning it properly, because the First World War, after all, on the Eastern Front they do these big encirclements, and it's the myth of Tannenberg and all that, which goes into attitudes in the German General Staff, or people who were present. Halder's in on the Eastern Front in 1917 when the Russians collapse. So his experience is of the Russians collapsing, whereas the 1940 plan is because you've got to take France seriously, because actually France effectively defeated the Prussian way of doing things and forced them into a ruinous stalemate that Germany knows it can't afford. Whereas they're thinking the Eastern Front, we'll just do what we did last time, but with on steroids, because we're invincible, because we defeated France, and because we've invented mobile warfare. But you've got people like Guderian saying, well, they're just savages. People, Guderian is supposed to be the intellectual of armoured warfare. Guderian, who that never seems to get lumped into his reputation as the brilliant lance of the German advance in 1940. Well, he's just the same as everyone else when it comes to how he regards the Eastern Front. And what I think is so fascinating in this book is you get this, obviously groupthink is the thing that occupies the way the Germans think an awful lot. That they're all full of groupthink, but they're also doing this thing, and I think this is really, really interesting. It's quite clear that quite a lot of them are making sure that they aren't the people who objected to the plan the way that they did in the run-up to the summer of 1940. Because there's a whole lot of people in the German army who in the run-up to the summer of 1940.
Even von Kleist, who's kind of
exactly. You're going, this is never going to work. We're biting off more than we can chew here. It's absurd. You've overbalanced things with giving it all to the punch through the Meuse and all that in the Ardennes, and so they're all basically arse covering in preparation for the miracle that they think is going to occur. on the Eastern Front. It's
Yeah.
amazing.
But
That's going on.
Listen to this, okay? So this is from an after-action report, a logistical after-action report in Panzer Group class. Between the 10th of May and the capture of Calais, which is on the 26th of June, there was not a single supply crisis that could not be resolved with the resources of Group von Kleist without in any way interfering with command functions. They think they've solved it, and
They think they solved it, and now they think they're not going up against a first-class opponent. So they think all we got to do is do the same thing we did last time. Even though you look at the scales, and you know, there's the Guderian's book about tanks before the war. He estimates there's 10,000 tanks in the Soviet army. And Hitler's supposed to have gone, if I believed the figures in those books, I'd never have gone to war with the Russians in the first place. And you think you've all talked yourselves into how brilliant you are, and you're applying the lessons of France to a completely different.
Yes, absolutely, and it cannot be stressed enough that France is a modern society with the most motorised vehicles in Europe of any country. Whereas the Soviet Union is not and doesn't have that infrastructure. And I mean, we should talk about George Thomas and his financial planning, but it's also worth talking about Adolf von Schell, who is the plenipotentiary general of motor vehicles, and his background is as an infantry officer and as a trainer of men, and he's like 4 times wounded in the First World War. He's much decorated. He even goes over to the United States in the early 1930s and does a stint as an instructor at Fort Benning, and writes a book called Infantry Tactics or something like that. I can't remember what it's called. You know, and suddenly in 1938 he ends up being the man in charge of military vehicles. And what he realises immediately is there's just too many types, because there is no mass production in Germany, and they're still on that kind of lots of sort of cottage industry in the motor industry. So yes, there is BMW, Mercedes and more, but there's lots and lots of workshops, there's lots of different people. And by the time he gets, he's got 131 different types of truck in 1939, and he goes, okay, well, what we need to do is and there's 1,367 different types of trailer, because basically they're just sort of being made in people's backyards and in village forges and stuff. You know, so it's all completely different. The trailers are not such a big deal, but the trucks is, because of course every truck has a different cut of gasket or distributor cap, or every bits of it. There's no consistency whatsoever. And so he says, what we really need to do is we really need to try to cut it down so that we've only got, we've got as few different types of trucks as possible, preferably only one type. And by 1939, they've got 23 different types of trucks, which is still, you can argue, at least 20 too many. And it just turns into, and Poland reveals all sorts of problems, and he says basically, I mean, there's always the thing about, Poland had gone another couple of weeks, he'd have run out of ammo. If Poland had gone another couple of weeks, they'd run out of vehicles. That's frustrating. So he's desperately trying to kind of work out what to do, and he sets up the Home Motor Vehicle Pool Organisation, which is the Heimat Kraft Fahrpark Organisation, and he basically just requisitions 50% of the civilian motor workshops. But it's just, he's always on a kind of sort of massive uphill struggle to try.
He's hiding to nothing, isn't he?
He's hiding to nothing.
Because what he's not able to do is standardise and comb through, and there isn't time.
No.
I mean, and at the same time, there's a rubber shortage. And I think what's really amazing is that they're literally waiting for rubber. They're waiting on people who manage to break the blockades.
Yeah.
So there's no predicted flow of rubber. They're basically, they've got their fingers crossed. And what's really interesting is this, all this bad news comes to Hal Greek and he goes, yeah, that'll be all right. That'll sort itself out. And there's a lot of that'll sort itself out going on in the planning in the planning for Barbarossa. It'll be all right. Short campaign will be fine. Don't worry about it. Yeah. I mean, I think we've talked about this often before. About the oil they're going to get in the Crimea and that'll in the Caucasus rather. And how once they get that oil, everything will be all right. We sort of think, and they're going into Russia for the stuff. It's one of the reasons they go into Russia is to get their hands on raw materials and so on. Yeah, but how long would that take to turn around? How long would you know, I mean, it's a question that's highlighted by what's happening right now in Ukraine. How long would it have taken to turn any of the places they'd conquered into somewhere useful and productive for them? Because after all, France's economy goes straight down the plug hole. You know, but by the autumn of 1940, the French economy is basically completely falling on itself. Doesn't work anymore. And in fact, the point is that the European integrated economy works when it's integrated, when everyone's trading with each other peaceably. And the minute it isn't, it collapses basically. So that the idea that you conquer places to get stuff, which is part of the raison d'etre, can't deliver.
You don't, well, you can, as long as you don't destroy everything as you go.
Well, obviously.
And you've got some buy-in from the occupied territory.
Well, there you are.
I mean, the point about France is really interesting because actually the damage is really, really minimal. I mean, the great cities aren't destroyed, the factories aren't destroyed.
Yeah.
The problem is, so they've got workforce, they've got infrastructure. There shouldn't be any issue whatsoever.
Yeah.
The problem is what the Germans don't have is lots of vehicles because they're not very automotive, as we've talked about ad infinitum in the past.
Yeah.
And because what they do is they just go, right, give us all your cash, give us all your supplies, give us all your coal, give us all your food, give us all your oil reserves, and we're going to half-inch all your vehicles. So all those perfectly intact factories just don't work anymore because they haven't got the stuff to make them work, and they haven't got the workforce to be able to get to work, and they haven't got the coal, and they haven't got the oil, so that doesn't work. But if you go into the Soviet Union and you are generous to those who are conquered, and you immediately get to work building factories and overseeing farms and are generous occupiers, then in Ukraine certainly you wouldn't have had any problem. But of course they don't do that. I mean, just to go back to Adolf von Schell and his problems. I mean, at Barbarossa, 88 infantry division, 3 different motorised infantry divisions and 1 tank divisions are all entirely 100% equipped with French vehicles. Can you imagine being the quartermaster of that? So even in 1942, even in 1942,
someone from Alsace-Lorraine, don't you, to do it?
I mean, it's an absolute joke. And then that's in addition to British vehicles and German vehicles. So even by 1942, even by the middle of 1942, by the time Case Blue starts, the Germans have got in their infantry 1,371 different vehicles of varying kinds. And so what von Schell has done is he has added into the whole process a 10% employment rate for spare parts. Okay.
In an attempt to fix the problem.
This is at the start. So we're anticipating we're going to need spare parts. So 10% of my capacity of trucks and whatnot and trains and all the rest of it is going to be devoted to spare parts. But by the middle of 1942, this has risen to 40%. And the problem is that means you need to produce spare parts. But the problem is that by that point you've had such an overwhelming loss of numbers that you're now spending more of your resources making spare parts than you are making new vehicles, which you need. So it's a sort of spiralling kind of web of mayhem. He's constantly battling uphill. He's tried to streamline the German motor industry before the war, from 1938 to 1939 and into 1940. He's desperately trying to kind of streamline the whole thing, and he just can't do it. There is just simply not the state backing for taking over companies and standardising everything. Yeah. So that just makes from a quartermaster's point of view, that just makes and supply point of view, that just makes life very, very difficult. So firstly, you haven't got a sort of streamlining off the conveyor belt. Then you've got this problem, you've got too many vehicles, which means you have lots and lots of parts. And the whole problem that you've got lots and lots of vehicles is because you haven't got enough vehicles in the first place of one car. Because of that lack of standardisation, because you haven't got mass production, you're having to make do with lots of different types of vehicles. But because you've got lots of different types of vehicles, then that's completely screwing up your supply chains, because you've got to have 1,000 different types of gasket rather than one. Yeah. And when you've got 3 trucks breaking down, one of them you can sort of you can go, okay, right, we're going to write this one off and we're going to take all the parts and use those parts. You can't do that because they're all different. Yeah. So what happens with poor old Schell is no one listens to him. He does what he possibly can, and does it very, all things considered, pretty well. He sets up these sort of motor pool organisation coercing kind of civilian operations. But then they get into the Soviet Union, and civilian motorised vehicles have to exist alongside military ones as well.
Yeah.
And the problem he's got is that as he's trying, as more and more are breaking down, so the amount of supply he needs to provide as a proportion dedicated to spare parts rises. But that comes at a cost, because you've got to make more spare parts, and you've got to then deliver them to the front. And to those repair units.
Well, I mean,
it just gets this sort of spiralling system where just everything is just going to pot. And I think what was just so fascinating about the Stahl is when you look at 2nd Panzer Group, Guderian's 4-division Panzer Group, which is one of the the 3 main spearheads. There's 1st, 2nd, 3rd Panzer Group. Those are the spearheads of the German army in Barbarossa.
Yeah.
And by the 29th of July, so that's only kind of sort of 5.5 weeks after the start of Barbarossa, Smolensk has fallen on whatever it was, 15th of July, but they're still fighting in this, Army Group Centre is still fighting in that kind of Smolensk area. The pockets have only just been closed and all the rest of it. They've lost, the 2nd Panzer Group is down by 70%.
Yeah.
Total losses or under repair, 71%. I mean, that's just incredible. So they have only 30% of the original strength.
Given the way Barbarossa has been planned, and given I don't mean the sort of the stuff, the actual sort of written down stuff, just the spirit in which it's been done. There's absolutely no way that information can be brought back. First of all, they know this is a problem. Halden knows this is a problem, but is entirely prepared to turn a blind eye to it, isn't he? Because he's just not interested in delivering bad news to anyone. He's also, there's also the fascinating business of him going behind Hitler's back to use Hungary as a jump-off point, and the Hungarians have said. Hitler said, absolutely not. We are not using Hungary as a staging point. We're not doing it. And Halder sets it up anyway, disobeys his orders, sets it up anyway, and builds that into the Barbarossa plan, which I think which is really, really interesting, given supposedly how this works is you do as you're told. How OKW works is you've got your orders, so you plan accordingly, and that's the headquarters Halder claims to run. Yet he himself is prepared to go behind Hitler's back, because after all, he's expecting they're all expecting a victory. So they're all expecting, when it comes out in the wash, that was my genius idea. Well done, everyone, and they'll all get patted on the back rather than actually being a problem. And so baked into Barbarossa is people lying to each other about, even at the very highest level, people lying to each other about actually what they're going to do, lying to each other about the state of the state of the here and the stuff that's available to it. So it's little wonder that. That only a month in, whatever, they're suffering this kind of problem, is it?
Yeah, and I mean, before we started recording this, you were kind of pointing out that extraordinary episode with General George Thomas.
It's amazing.
And Thomas is, for those who don't know, George Thomas is the head of the economic division of the OKW. So he's the head of the kind of economic department, finance department of the German General Staff.
Yeah.
And so in February, he draws up this plan of the kind of financial implications and what they think they can do and what they think they can gain from the breadbasket of Europe and all the rest of it in Ukraine and what resources they can get. And basically he hands it in and everyone goes, no, sorry, that's that's not doable. That'll never get past Hitler.
Yeah.
You need to go back and rethink it. And this is Keitel, isn't it? Keitel is the head of the
Keitel.
And so Thomas goes back and redrafts it and basically delivers a kind of lavish report, sort of saying it's all going to be fine, it's going to be great, we're going to be able to get this, everyone goes perfect. I mean, it's just insane. But this is what happens when your commander-in-chief, the top dog, lives in this sort of bunker complex where all people only tell tell him what he wants to hear. And where he believes
this
that just
is
will...
before Hitler's locked himself away, though, isn't it? Before
Yes,
he's
but
made
everything-
himself unavailable to everybody.
Yes, but he's still... But at this point, he's commander-in-chief, right? And he's still kind of removed from reality, and he's still only listening to what he wants to hear. And he's very into this idea that of course they'll be fine because we will will it, because we're Germans and we're superior. So I kind of sort of think this is what happens when you've got that kind of sort of bunker mentality, when you're surrounding yourself by yes men and people are too terrified.
Although he's not yet actually locked in a bunker at this point. So this is sort of salad days Hitler, isn't it? Where it's all working out and everyone they're high on their sort of blitzkrieg hype.
just a few days and saw relatively few casualties. It helped set in motion events that would lead to the breakup of Yugoslavia and far greater bloodshed in Croatia, Bosnia and Kosovo. One of the Yugoslav soldiers based in Slovenia at the time was Dejan Djokic. He's now a historian based at Goldsmiths University, and for his current research project, he's revisiting the conflict, investigating his own memories as well as those of former comrades. He was joined in conversation by BBC History magazine editor Rob Attar.
So Dejan, before we talk specifically about the war in Slovenia, I think we'll probably need a bit of background about Yugoslavia in the early 1990s. So how had the country come to the point where constituent parts of it started to look to break away?
Yeah, this is a kind of an obvious question to start with, and it's also a very difficult question to answer. I think there are several kind of factors that contributed to this eventually fragmentation and a violent war, or rather a series of wars, one can say, that followed. There were 3 other wars that followed: Slovenia and Croatia, Bosnia, and then Kosovo at the end of the decade. One could start with the death of President Tito, who was also Marshal Tito. He was in charge of the army as well, in 1980. So Tito was this powerful leader who emerged first as a resistance leader and the Communist Party leader during the Second World War in occupied Yugoslavia. And he led a successful resistance movement against Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy, and a series of local collaborators, most notably the Croatian Ustaša regime. He also fought against a royalist resistance, or also various groups that also sometimes collaborated with the enemy in order to fight against the communists. So this is the first thing to keep in mind. And Tito and the Communist Party were able to not only liberate what was effectively the first former Yugoslavia, but also to reunite it and to reimagine it as a kind of federation of 6 socialist republics, the largest one of which was Serbia, which itself had 2 kind of autonomous regions, provinces, Vojvodina in the north and Kosovo in the south. This was very much based on the Soviet model, in which you had a Russian republic within the Soviet Union, which itself was also a federation, the Russian Federation within the Soviet Federation. The second thing to keep in mind is that even though Tito was and the Yugoslav Communist Party at that time were unquestionably Stalinist, they clashed with Stalin in 1948. By the end of the 1940s, Yugoslavia under the Communist Party and under Tito's leadership became a country that successfully resisted both the Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy and then Stalin's Soviet Union. And unsurprisingly, this also led to quite a lot of interest in Yugoslavia and support from the West. So Yugoslavia received quite a lot of economic but also military aid from the United States in particular, but also Great Britain in the 1950s. Later, Yugoslavia reconciled with the Soviets after the death of Stalin in 1953, but it never became a member of the Soviet bloc, and it never joined the Warsaw Pact, and similarly it never joined NATO or Western institutions. Instead, it was some sort of a neutral, but not exactly neutral country. It actually pursued a policy of active and peaceful coexistence and non-alignment in foreign affairs. The reason why this is important is that for Yugoslavia, Cold War is crucial for this existence of Yugoslavia, for the stability of Yugoslavia as a country that was a communist country but not part of the Soviet bloc, that was a European country, but its main foreign policy focus was actually on what we now call Global South, or used to be called the Third World, the Asian and African countries. There were also several South American, Latin American countries, and also Cyprus was involved in this movement. But Yugoslavia was kind of the only really European country that was part of this. And Tito is central to this. President Tito, who, as I said, was also, and this is important, he was the head of state, he was chairman of the Communist Party, and he was also marshal. He was in charge of the army. So he's a central figure. And this is how Yugoslavia kind of understands itself. In the last few years, we have had, anniversaries of the end of the Cold War and kind of the end of the East-West binary. Well, for Yugoslavs, this binary did not exist so much. I mean, it was there, but they understood their position in the world slightly differently. But of course, Yugoslavia's place in this world, which was not simply, East-West, but it was more complex, was nevertheless very much dependent on that kind of balance of power, and also on the leadership of this very strong leader, Tito. One thing I didn't maybe mention, and I will not go into any detail, but what happened in occupied Yugoslavia during the Second World War was even more violent than what happened in the 1990s. And I don't mean just the very, very brutal Nazi German occupation, for instance, in Serbia, or Italian occupation of what is now Dalmatia, Croatian coast and Montenegro. But I mean the war among the Yugoslavs between various Serb and Croat and Bosnian Muslim groups, but also among these groups. Very brutal war was fought by, for instance, communist Serbs and royalist Serbs, and similarly among Croats. Something like 1 million people died in the territory of what was Yugoslavia, which at the time had around 16 million population. Now, during the wars of the 1990s, the figure is thankfully much lower. It's almost certainly not higher than 150,000 in a country that at that time had 25 million population. So this is just to give you an illustration how brutal this war was. Nevertheless, Tito and the Communist Party managed to reunite the Yugoslavs. I guess in a long way I've already given you an answer to some of the factors that kept Yugoslavia together, that or perhaps helped keep Yugoslavia together. I think this was a little bit more simple. It would be simplistic to say that there were only these factors, because this idea about the Yugoslav unity actually dates back to the first half of the 19th century, and it's very similar to German and Italian kind of unificationist movements of that era of the 19th century. But nevertheless, by the late 1980s, Tito is no longer alive. The international relations that kind of defined Yugoslavia in many ways, and to which Yugoslavia made an important contribution, were also kind of changing, and changing quite radically. But of course there was a number of other reasons. Nationalism is something that historians and sociologists are debating whether this nationalism ever went away or it was simply kept under control by the Communist Party. I think this is also very simplistic. Communism anywhere, including in the Soviet Union, often used nationalism as an ideology that in certain times could help with popular support and with mass mobilization. And the same was true of Yugoslavia. Nevertheless, Tito kept a kind of fine balance within Yugoslavia. So he kind of kept especially Serbs, but also Croats, on a tight leash, because they were the two largest and potentially most destructive nations for this federation. But then he encouraged some smaller nationalisms, for instance Montenegrin and eventually Bosnian Muslim, Macedonian, or their identities became stronger and recognized officially by the state. But again, this is all this balance is kind of disappearing towards the late 1980s, and Yugoslavia also really from the late 1960s, but certainly from the mid-70s, becomes a loose federation. It's increasingly confederalized, really, and its 6 constituent republics are now described by the Yugoslav 1974 constitution as states, sovereign states within the Yugoslav Federation. Yugoslavia almost moves towards some sort of a socialist, mini-socialist European Union on the southeast periphery of Europe, right? And so this is kind of, and we know in recent times that certain countries, when certain countries declare independence or seek independence from a broader federation, that this could actually destabilize things considerably. On top of that, there was also a serious economic crisis in the 1980s. By that time, it became clear that that state socialist command economies were not working. One thing that perhaps I could add at this point is that another dilemma for me as a historian is to what extent do I put an emphasis on events on the top among the leadership and political and intellectual elites, and to what extent events driven from below. And I think one needs to kind of combine both. But what was very unfortunate for Yugoslavia is that in the 1980s there was a series of leaders emerged who actually were not really interested in kind of dialogue and kind of peaceful resolution to a series of political and economic crises, but rather in promoting their own republic or perhaps their own nation, their own ethnic group. And this is especially true of Serbia's new leader, Slobodan Milosevic, who became the leader of the Serbian Communist Party in 1987, after a conflict within the party in which he managed to marginalize and then completely purge a more moderate faction that was actually in favor of a dialogue. And so the final point in this first part is that Yugoslavia, as I mentioned at the beginning of my answer, was a federation of 6 republics, and in the case of Serbia, a republic that had its 2 provinces. And it was in some ways an ethnic federation, so each republic had a titular nation. So Slovenia was the republic for the Slovenians, Croatia for the Croats, but also for a rather sizable Croatian Serb minority, which in 1991 numbered around 11 to 12%. Bosnia, which kind of resembled a mini Yugoslavia with something like 40 to 43% of Bosnian Muslim population and 34% Bosnian Serb and just under 20% Bosnian Croat population, was nobody's titular republic. But nevertheless, it was understood as possibly primarily a Bosnian Muslim republic, since they had no other republic. But as I said already, so 1/3 of Bosnia's population was Serb, and 1/6 maybe of Croatia's population was also Serb. And so from Serbia's leadership point of view, from Milosevic's point of view, well, the thinking was, if this federation is going to further kind of become further loose and possibly even disintegrate, where do we draw the borders of these new successor states? Should they be these republics? Or should they be modified, these borders, so that they kind of more or less resemble ethnic borders, which of course would not be possible without a conflict, because people lived in mixed areas, especially in Bosnia, but also parts of Croatia and parts of Serbia. And to make things even more complicated, the last Yugoslav constitution of 1974 was not actually clear on this question. This was debated widely, but the problem was that the constitution supported both views. You could argue that the constitution argued that these republics should be allowed, should they wish so, to become independent, but also that the peoples of Yugoslavia can do that. So both sides used interpreted the constitution in the way that it suited them. Now this paradox actually became clear already in 1974, but while Tito was alive, it did not matter. Tito was this overall leader, and the Yugoslav army was the only institution that was never federalized. So these two institutions kept the federation together. By the beginning of the Slovenian War, or the final Yugoslav crisis, which really one could argue started in January 1990, when the League of Communists of Yugoslavia, as the Communist Party of Yugoslavia was officially called, collapsed. Its last Congress in Belgrade was held in January in Belgrade 1990. And after a series of disagreements and arguments, the Slovenian and Croatian delegates left the Congress. And this was January 1990. In June 1991, these two republics would declare independence from the Yugoslav Federation. So what happened in January 1990 and the last Congress of the Communist Party in a way anticipated the political developments of a year and a half later.
It's obviously a very complex history, so thank you for going through that all for us. So the focus of our discussion today is mainly on what happened in Slovenia. So as you said, Slovenia declared independence, and then a short war was fought. So what was the kind of broader Yugoslav reaction to the Slovenian Declaration of Independence?
a brief background again. So when scholars or outside observers look at Yugoslavia historically,